It was a bright, cold day in Aprilis, 1166 years Anno Julii, and the sundials struck 13. Romulus Augustulus V, seated in his opulent Ravenna palace, agonized over fresh reports from the turbulent northern front lines. The Vikings, once a formidable force with capabilities to raid as far south as Gades, now found themselves retreating into the unforgiving mountains and fjords of Norvegia, pushed back by the relentless Roman forces. Ambitious generals eager to curry imperial favor competed for greater and greater triumphs, from Annius Rax conquering Herulia in 1109 to the great naval commander Maximinius subduing the island stronghold of Gotium just 5 years before Romulus came to the throne. However, the emperor knew from his predecessors that only on pain of military disaster could the Norsemen be underestimated. Although naval engagements were still routinely won by the Vikings, each one exacted a heavier toll than the previous, as the Norse could not match the manpower nor the resources of the empire. Poets and polemicists of the era reminisced of the ancient struggles between Athens and Sparta, another clash between a land-based juggernaut and a maritime power that had entered the pages of mythology. However, the Imperial Navy was steadily growing in strength and sophistication, adapting to the harsh winds and waves of the unyielding Atlantic rather than the simple turbulence of the Mediterranean waters. It was poised to become the mightiest fleet in the known world, rivaled only by the Saracens to the far east. This naval force was preparing to embark upon a top-secret mission known only to the Imperial inner circle, one that Romulus hoped would bear fruit and confine the Norse to Europe, rather than allowing them to escape forever westward. The emperor could only hope that the Vikings had not learned of this mission through their spies in the Varangian Guard and managed to flee to Vinland already. Romulus leaned back in his antique golden chair, the very same used by the first emperor Julius Caesar on the Senate floor over a millennium previously. His mind flickered back to the events of the late Republican period. In the wake of the Great Civil War between Gnaeus Pompey Magnus and Gaius Julius Caesar, the latter had elevated allies like Antony, Brutus, Decimus, Lepidus and others to prominent statures within the Roman state, granting them power and influence to shape the Republic in their image. The last holdout of resistance to Caesar's rule died on Sardinia with Pompey's son Sextus Pompeius and his ally Cassius Longinus after both were assassinated by their own men who defected to Caesar following a 600-day siege. Gaius Julius Caesar's name would be revered down the centuries for his projects, infrastructural, cultural, and academic as well as political, both at home and internationally. His reconstruction of the ancient city of Carthage to its pre-Punic glory. His patronage of a new library in Rome, known as the Biblia Julia, grew to a stature matched only by the Library of Alexandria in the eons that followed. His calendar, devised with Sosigenes in 53 Anno Julii, would be spread through merchants to each corner of the known world. He empowered men like his adopted son Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, alongside his friend Agrippa to see to the restoration of Rome's former civic prestige after years of neglect and deterioration during the street riots of Clodius and the war with the Pompeians. In the short term, the efforts of Caesar, Octavian and Agrippa replenished Rome after years, decades, even generations of social decay as well as the devastation inflicted by the civil war. Emissaries from as far as Bactria, India and the distant Serica, under the Han dynasty, flooded the Palatine and Capitoline hills bearing gifts and greetings, eager to return to their homelands with stories of this magnificent realm to the west. In the long term, Caesar's legacy, both physically manifested in the character of the city of Rome as well as reputationally echoed through the pages of legend, would withstand the centuries and act as the definitive guide for all emperors, governors, generals and magistrates of all varieties. With full executive freedom from any further Pompeian, senatorial or republican challenges, Caesar reorganized Rome into an empire 7 years after the immortalized Battle of Pharsalus. On his 60th birthday, he crowned himself her emperor. Legionaries, centurions and legates now swore an individual oath of loyalty to Caesar rather than to the generals or governors under whom they served. This was done in an effort to strip the legal legitimacy of another ambitious general who dared cross the Rubicon and march on the capital, as Caesar himself and Sulla before him had both done. He deliberately dismantled the rotten corpse of Roman politics, stuffing the Senate with loyal veterans from the Gallic and Civil Wars, as well as granting more power to the civil assembly and tribunes of the plebs, who were kept loyal with expansions to the grain dole and the redistribution of land previously owned by Pompeian politicians. He devoted time and legislative bandwidth towards the reform of provincial administration, a lifelong fascination of his, to be more efficient and be run primarily by military governors elected by the legions rather than appointed by the Senate. Cisalpine Gaul was integrated into Italia, a reward to the province from its former governor for years of faithful allegiance. He used the religious supremacy granted to him by his role as Pontifex Maximus to reorient Roman diplomacy towards a more conciliatory approach with the kingdoms and tribes along Rome's borders, particularly those across the Rhine, the Danube and the Gallic Channel, who were soon transformed into client states loyal to Roman interests. Caesar's diplomatic prowess was most evident when Mark Antony, leading a delegation to Memphis on his behalf, brokered peace between the Ptolemaic and Ethiopian Solomonid dynasties in 62 Anno Julia. This détente was then used to redirect Egyptian resources towards an anti-Parthian coalition in which Rome and Egypt would, alongside Armenia, the Mesopotamian Caracenes and the Arab tribes disgruntled by Parthian mistreatment, bring the Arsacids to their knees in 62 Anno Julia. The Romans retrieved the eagle standards lost at Carrhae by Crassus and prominently displayed them in the following triumph as a symbol of Roman rejuvenation. As Caesar approached his death, he, alongside his cabal of experienced commanders, would go on to wage successive and increasingly exhausting wars against the Parthians. Each time a peace deal was brokered with the beleaguered Arsacids, Rome's borders would encroach ever further to the east. When the Romans entered Babylon in 69 Anno Julia, the symbolism and parallels with Alexander the Great were lost on no one. By the time the Zagros Mountains were breached 4 years later, most of the day-to-day tactics were delegated to men like Lepidus, Decimus and Antony. With this team, the crowning achievement of Caesar's career was grasped: the complete and unconditional surrender of the Arsacid dynasty to Roman dominance after the legions reached the Indus. They would walk in Caesar's final triumph, while the Parthian people became the subjects of the Greek-descended Bactrians, who themselves were clients of Rome. As his finest legions, spearheaded by his beloved 13th, marched back westward for a special three-pronged triumph in Babylon, Alexandria and then Rome, Caesar knew he had truly surpassed his Macedonian idol. The final line of the newly crowned Emperor Augustus's obituary to his father, read out before attendance at Caesar's funeral pyre, came to be inscribed upon the Senate House in the Forum and remained situated at the heart of Roman political thought for the centuries to come. It read, "All at once, the world belonged to the Romans." In subsequent centuries, Rome would expand its influence across the Danube and the Rhine to the extent that virtually every tribe in Europe, Germanic, Slavic, Hunnic and Gaelic, paid tribute in manpower and supplies to populate Rome's armies and feed her war machine. Ties were strengthened with the Han dynasty after initial positive, but tenuous, contact had been established during Caesar's reign. Each empire sent merchant fleets stocked with their most valuable commodities, every shipment met with grand processions and elaborate ceremonies in Rome and Nanjing. The words and teachings of Confucius made their way to classrooms and libraries, first in Babylon, then Rome, and then every city in the empire. The Roman aristocracy became obsessed with the silk and porcelain imports, which were worth many times more than their weight in salt. Meanwhile, Roman military minds investigated reports of a grand structure built by the Saracens, designed to keep the unending hordes of pillaging steppe nomads from intruding upon the Middle Kingdom. Inspired by this, the Emperor Gratian, great-grandson of Augustus, ordered the construction of similar walls, starting with the gap between the Danube and Rhine and then broadening to include structures in Armenia and Arabia. These walls were completed to a satisfactory degree 8 decades after Gratian's death. However, construction would never truly cease, as each emperor felt invigorated to prove their infrastructural and military passion by modifying, strengthening and expanding them. Romulus Augustulus V was currently in consultation with his generals and engineers about the incorporation of Saracen gunpowder into the fortifications in Polonia in search of ways to fend off the Norse-sponsored barbarian agitation against the border. Contact had been made with peoples east of the Indus, north of Scythia and in the deserts of Garamantia. The Romans extended not just their military and diplomatic tentacles but also their administrative influence, manifested in aqueducts and sewers and advanced roadways, to each corner of the empire, and her engineering and concrete became the envy of all who traveled the Silk Road. Through these centuries, Rome was not left completely unblemished by history. The stability and integrity of the empire was threatened from time to time by ambitious pretenders to the throne or devastating pandemics that ravaged the population, helped in their spread by ease of access to the east. A number of emperors even met their end to these plagues. However, throughout these challenging times, the legalistic and meritocratic example left by their forebears like the emperors Caesar and Antonius, son of Mark Antony by Augustus's sister Octavia, helped them prevail and keep the empire afloat and prosperous. When General Verus of the 11th Gallic Legion, after having led many successful campaigns of subjugation against the Germans, Arabians and Berbers, was refused his pick of successor as governor of Gaul, he turned his sights on Rome and marched across the Rubicon. Emperor Illyrian responded calmly and tactfully, inviting the usurper to Ostia to negotiate a compromise rather than drive the empire into years of turmoil and bloodshed. In the end, Verus was placated with titles and territory in exchange for his recognition of Illyrian's pick for the governorship. The emperor met aggression and opposition with clemency and diplomacy as he knew Caesar would have done. In 158 Anno Julii, less than a century after Julius Caesar's death, a new religion rose in the Levant. The aged emperor of the time Aurelianus, the son of one of Augustus's legates, took careful note of the growing influence of the man and increasing number of Jews called Messiah. Many in the upper echelons of the bureaucracy perceived this, Christianity, as a passive and harmless offshoot of Judaism, not worth persecuting and thereby antagonizing the Judeans. Others, particularly the court of pontiffs and influential Vestal virgins, called on the emperor, as Pontifex Maximus, to exterminate the growing faith as it presented a stalwart challenge to the ancient cult of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Aurelianus decided on a different approach. He opted to manipulate the growth of Christianity in his favor to see whether or not it could provide some administrative value to the empire. The emperor invited he who was called Christ for a conference in Corinth. After receiving assurances from Christ that he intended no challenge to Roman rule in Judea and that he sought only to teach moral lessons to the Jews and Gentiles of the region, Aurelianus was satisfied that neither Christ nor his followers required persecution or extermination. He also felt that Jesus could provide further value to Rome's ends. King Herod III, grandson of the same Herod the Great appointed by Emperor Antonius in 110 Anno Julii, was a young ruler with all of his grandfather's lust and greed but none of his political acumen. He was a corrupt, unpleasant and unpopular leader as well as an unreliable vassal of Rome. He siphoned away imperial subsidies for his own lavish palaces and extravagant parties and parades while inventing excuse after excuse, each more contrived than the previous one, for why he could not and would not supply Rome with the agreed men and supplies for her wars. Previous emperors had tolerated his hedonism and incoherence as they had priorities elsewhere. Emperor Aurelianus, however, felt the time was now to settle the matter with a new client king of Judea, useful to the empire and popular with the Jews. Antoninus Pilate, governor of Syria, was instructed to accompany Christ back to Jerusalem and force Herod's abdication. No troops were to be left in Jerusalem as Aurelianus did not wish to engender resentment towards Rome in Judea. Aurelianus ordered the pontiffs back in Rome to begin introducing the concept of the Christ into the Roman pantheon in order to co-opt the prophecies and metaphysical aspects of Jesus' teachings into Roman culture and scholarship. Further to this end, the Greek scholar Siracassia was sent to accompany Pilate eastwards, conducting interviews with Christ to explore his worldview and moral prescriptions. He then codified and synthesized these views into a series of manuscripts which became the basis of the Christian philosophy which was practiced alongside the works of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates and, later, Confucius, in classrooms from Babylon to Bernicia. By the time of Romulus, Christianity had become a major school of philosophy, and although he himself subscribed to no philosophy ahead of others as was customary for the emperors, Augustulus appointed many Christians to positions of influence in the Roman government. The emergence of the Mohammedans in 710 Anno Julii presented a similar proposition to the Emperor Marcianus IV. He knew very well the strategy of his predecessor centuries prior. However, rather than seek to incorporate the new religion into the cultural and administrative fabric of the Roman society, he chose to take a firmer approach. His diplomacy and keen eye for administrative opportunities were not as fine-tuned as Aurelianus's, and he himself was not fond of the growing cultural hegemony of Christianity over the Greek classics. He was a conservative who valued stability and social order, so when his advisors suggested that some of the more militaristic aesthetical components of Islam be adopted and that they should emulate what Aurelianus had done, he strongly disagreed and diverged from these views, instead implementing an arm's-length policy with the newborn religion. Muhammad was recognized as the caliph of the Arabian hinterlands beyond Roman jurisdiction, but he was compelled to pay tribute to Rome and limit Islamic proselytization within imperial territory. A garrison was left on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea to ensure the caliph and his successors behaved themselves and kept to their agreements. Some criticized this heavy-handed approach as guaranteeing resentment towards Rome within the leadership and population of the Arab Caliphate, drawing reference to how Aurelianus deliberately avoided using soldiers to enforce his will on the people of Judea centuries earlier. Despite this, no dissent was aired in public, and Marcianus's policy had persisted for the centuries to come. By 1166 Anno Julii, the Caliphate proved a reliable commercial partner but a decidedly unequal one. In the back of every emperor's mind was the fear that one day, while they were off campaigning in northern Europe, the Arabs would turn on Rome and cripple her eastern flank. As such, the garrison always remained and Islam was always contained in Arabia. Caesar himself was revered to near godlike status, with everyone from the lowliest plebe day laborer to the proudest imperial senator acknowledging the monumental changes he had ushered in and almost worshipping him. From the Julian calendar to the month of July to the generous grain dole to the golden Julian chair in which Emperor Augustulus now sat, all became crucial features of the Roman cultural canon. Subsequent emperors continued to be fair-minded, capable and diplomatic leaders who guided their people to glory with Caesar's example to follow. Although lionized by Roman playwrights, poets and historians, Caesar's reign was not free from scrutiny, nor was the example he set for future emperors seen to be without room for improvement. Particularly on the question of imperial succession, Caesar did not lay down specifications for how this should work. Many historians attributed this to the fact that there was little dispute who would succeed him as ruler after his death: his son Octavian, who came to be known as the Emperor Augustus. He had been specifically groomed for the role over many years, numerous military campaigns, administrative projects and diplomatic missions. He was popular with the people and, although not as charismatic a rhetorician as his father or Antony, he was seen universally as competent and a worthy successor to Caesar. For the first few emperors, a strong meritocratic tone was maintained, and each emperor was personally mentored by his predecessor in the way to rule. However, as Caesar's time receded from living memory, this tradition began to weaken, corruption and nepotism seeping in as emperors began appointing closer and closer relatives and financial donors as their heirs and to other positions of sway such as consul and praetor. This rot only became obvious to the Roman public once it became critical, a civil war nearly breaking out between two brothers vying for the emperorship after the death of their father. The crisis was only narrowly averted by an outbreak of war with the Rajasthanis across the Indus. Though the Romans repelled the Rajasthani incursion, the younger brother, Titus, died to an Indian arrowhead, and so his brother Dorian had a clear path to the imperial throne. However, overwhelming pressure from the Senate, public and, most importantly, the army command structure, who did not desire to be ordered to their deaths in some worthless civil war, forced his hand in codifying the laws of succession. These new statutes mandated that upon an emperor's coronation, they had to appoint an heir immediately. This successor had to be an adult male Roman citizen from a different dynasty to that of the previous two emperors. The Senate then had to approve this appointment, though only once between Dorian and Romulus had the Senate ever refused. This system remained virtually unchanged, apart from introduction of tribune approval to the process by Emperor Valentinian in 418 Anno Julii, for 1,000 years, and was how Romulus himself had been chosen. Once elevated, each newly crowned emperor could choose their imperial name, such as Gratian, who had named himself after the famed Gracchi brothers who had pushed for radical populist reforms in the Republican era, and Romulus Augustulus, who wished to emulate the great historical giants of Romulus and Augustus, seeking for himself an equally large portion of the Roman historical and cultural zeitgeist as these two figures. In Romulus's day, Roman citizens were the most literate and well-nourished in the world. Thanks to a succession of talented emperors who undertook ambitious agricultural and infrastructural projects and public services to ensure a thriving populace, and in doing so, etched their names in the annals of history. Emperor Augustulus had picked up a plan to bridge the Messina Strait, connecting Sicilia to Italia, and was investing enormous sums of his own money into the project. Although some detractors quietly whispered that this was nothing more than a ludicrous vanity project, in public he was met with widespread acclaim. Although it was projected to take hundreds of years to complete, Augustulus hoped it would nevertheless immortalize him alongside his namesakes in the history books. Romulus was brought sharply back to the present moment by a severe knocking at the door. Once summoned inside, the centurion breathed heavily. "My emperor." Romulus instructed the man to take a breath. "Our scouts have intercepted a Norse longship in the seas north of Caledonia." The emperor's ears perked up. "In which direction were they bound?" he asked. "West. Which leads us to suspect," came the reply. "What is the status of the crew?" Romulus pressed, curtly. "All captured and in custody, currently being transported along the Rhine." The emperor breathed a quiet moment of jubilation. He then looked the centurion sternly in the eye, making sure the soldier was aware of the seriousness of the following request. "I want them brought before me. Make arrangements for their transportation and ensure they arrive in Ravenna unharmed." "My lord." With a sharp Roman salute, he left. Minutes were spent deep in thought. Perhaps these men could aid Romulus in cementing his name in history. Perhaps they could reveal what their leaders sought so breathlessly to the west. Perhaps this would eternalize the emperor's name in the chronicles on par with Marcianus IV, Gratian, or Aurelianus. Rome was ascendant, and on this bright, cold April's day, 1166 years since the birth of Julius Caesar, Romulus Augustulus was her emperor.